trade pie or a bigger part of their exports pie is just going to a number of countries all around the world.
What does that look like on the ground in these other countries? If China has shifted its attention to them, what does it look like when they're exporting so much to other countries?
What it looks like is job loss. It looks like anger. And once that factory closes, I mean, that city is at risk. And that's exactly what we saw in the States. It's exactly what we're seeing now across emerging markets. And it's not just workers, of course, it's also retailers, it's also local industry executives and companies that are feeling the pain of this.
When we talk about Chinese exports, are we talking about electronics principally? So what in sum is China exporting to the world?
So it started with steel. So they began exporting a few years ago record amounts of steel to economies like Mexico, like Brazil, as well as Southeast Asia. But something we've noticed is that it's actually become much bigger than that. It's not just steel anymore. It's not just EVs, it's not just renewable goods. It's not just batteries. It's everything. It's everything from steel to shoes to calculators.
Economists are calling this a new China shock, a term first used to describe the dramatic impact Chinese exports had on the U.S. labor market starting in the late 1990s. This time, the shock is more global. But China's big export push is not without some domestic cost. While exports have buoyed the economy as the government seeks to deflate a property bubble, Trump's tariffs are forcing authorities to now ramp up consumer spending to diversify the economy.
Yeah, this is kind of the big question for China right now. You can see that the government, policymakers in China in 2025 have really made consumption and pivoting to local consumption a big priority exactly because of this. It's a reaction to tariffs, to Trump's tariffs, and it's also an acknowledgement that China cannot simply rely on exports forever to fuel growth. They really need to pivot at some point, something economists and countries around the world have been saying for years now. The first set of tariffs that came in 2018, 2019, was one of the things that prompted this China shock that we're now seeing globally. One thing that Chinese policymakers need to think about now is not just U.S. tariffs, but also tariffs from their neighbors and their allies, and markets where they thought that it was pretty safe to start selling goods.
The tariffs President Trump put in place on China during his first term redirected a flood of cheap Chinese exports from the U.S. to other countries around the world. In his second term, his administration has already raised tariffs by 20% and has threatened further increases. Those tariffs risk sending more cheap Chinese goods and materials around the world, making it hard for other countries to compete. Bloomberg's Dmitrieva says those other countries are trying to figure out how they can defend themselves.